Yeah, super cool. Yeah, actually, it was not really planned that you come from the left side or the right side, so we kind of
Improvise.
improvised randomly, but it was very good. Yeah, I hope you guys had a very nice conference already. I think the venue is really nice. I think the last code talk that I've been to was in 2015, 16, something in Berlin still. So it's a long time ago and was still in Berlin. Yeah. Coming to the topic, so as things that we're going to talk about the state of GenAI, right? I think I think the whole conference was probably about AI, right? Vibe coding and so on, and we're just going to give our realistic opinion on where are we right now and where we are going, right? Just to do a short introduction about us. So today there's Alejandro. He's the director at Zalando. He worked for the Ethical ML Institute before, but also for the UN. And I'm that. I have my own data consultancy right now, Datanomic, but before that I headed AI at Axel Springer and also Idealo. All right, what did this talk about? Well, we already talked about AI, Gen AI, right? But in 2025, obviously everyone was talking about AI, right? You see it on LinkedIn, you see it on the news, everywhere. Obviously, what we exactly talk about Gen AI, we talk about ChatGPT, we talk about agents and vibe coding. We also talk about multimodality, so there was not just only text, but we also talk about voice, and also we had a lot of new video models as well. Who of you actually use ChatGPT daily? Oh, it's actually not 100%. That's interesting. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Who of you use a large language model? Okay, that's similar. Yeah. But basically, AI is becoming like a day-to-day tool already, right? So there's 800 million people using ChatGPT weekly. Obviously, we didn't count like Claude, right, or other tools like Mistral, but that's a huge number. On the other hand, there's also job paradox. So you probably heard, right? Amazon is firing people, Google is firing people, everyone in the US, big tech is firing people. And it is true, right? You can feel this in Germany as well, that there's a decline in jobs, especially for junior developers. The question where this will go, right, and how we want to do it is something that we also try to answer in our talk a bit. This is you probably heard of Daniel Raleigh before, right? He talked about big data. Alejandro and me are kind of old already in the industry for a long time. We've been through a lot of phases through big data and data science. And every time this quote was also correct, right? So basically, big data, or now it's Gen AI, is like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it, but really no one really knows how to do it. And everyone claims it's doing it, right? And that's kind of a little bit true also for Gen AI in some perspective. So this is the agenda for today. So Alejandro will talk a little bit about the Gen AI myth, what it can do and what it can't do. I will go a little bit deeper into agents, talking about what agents are and also the experience with I have. Also then I will also talk about vibe coding, and then basically Alejandro will summarize it with what Gen AI products you can use today, especially for developers. And then we also try to give a little bit of outlook as well, how Gen AI is going.
Great, great. So we're going to start also with some of the myths in Gen AI. I think we hear that it's going to solve all the problems, but at the end, we also have to be quite pragmatic, right? In terms of the iceberg, right, we're starting from the top, right, and we're slowly going to be going down and down as we go through the slides and presentation. We're going to dive into five myths. So the first one is LLMs are general purpose for all use cases, right? So this is something that probably like has come up, right? You've tried it once and you say, oh my God, it can solve the world. And I want to actually like see from the room, overall, who here thinks in terms of putting a prototype or a model into production? Who thinks it would be a good idea to use an LLM as a sentiment classifier, right, for a particular input, right? Predict for a class, predict for a binary, right? Show of hands, who think it's a good idea? Yeah, I mean, not too bad, right? I mean, maybe okay, maybe a little bit too much compared to something like scikit-learn, right? What about perhaps thinking of using it as multi-class classifier, right? I mean, still okay, more or less, right? You're probably better off training something more specialized. But what about then thinking, yeah, predicting the prices for the following time series data set, right? That's when it starts getting a little bit, perhaps dodgy, right? You start putting it to like trade some stock, right, on crypto exchange, or even starting to just optimize, warehouse allocation, right? Obviously, when it comes to LLMs, like any other tool, there is a time and a place, right? And this is also something that we're going to have to see today, right? These things are not just magic, right? They allow you to actually deliver, use cases that they're fit for. So that's one of the myths. We're going to talk a little bit more. Second myth, largest opportunities, lie within LLM task automation, right? We've seen all of this workflow automation, right? It's like you have the way of doing this stuff. Why don't you just put an agent in between, right? However, when it comes to automation, yes, you're introducing ways of cost saving in terms of, OpEx, right? However, at the end, it's not that simple, right? And the value actually is unlocked whenever you actually identify things that create value, right? Not just automate the current. So to think, hey, I'm going to automate these humans with this tiny, maybe, not as intelligent human, right? Intern that is going to do it. There may be other opportunities, right? Like doing forecasting, automation, optimization on top, right? We continue. Another myth, right? Algorithmic bias and ethics is not a GenAI problem, right? That's just a machine learning problem. We don't have to care about it anymore, right? And we've actually seen, if you've been involved in machine learning in any organization, right? I actually really like this meme that says, hey, the battle with the robots in the future was super easy to defeat. How did that happen? And then if you look at the training data, it was all skewed mostly towards sticks and stones, right? But this is true, right? When it comes to machine learning, what do they do? Learn, right? And in that specific case, you can learn the biases. You can learn the human, a bit too human, right? Here, for example, we see in the context of applied scientists, right, software engineers, when they create machine learning models, there's not just the putting it through the fence, but also you may have the situations where the legal team appears and says, what have you done, right? It's like you didn't think about these considerations, compliance, data privacy, governance, blah, 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 right? Not as simple. The next one, the S in MCP stands for security, right? Can you find the S, right? So for this one, basically, we've actually seen a couple of cases, high-profile cases, where LLMs have actually caused security incidents and vulnerabilities. Here you have the lethal trifecta, right? Untrusted content, external calls, private data. So, hey, we're now in SQL injections like it's 1997, right? You go into your website, you go into your query URL, and in the get, you put an apostrophe, drop all tables from blah, right? So we need to be careful, right? This just goes back to fundamentals. So this is another thing to think about, right? And here we saw one of the examples with Claude that basically just steals crypto wallets, right? I mean, yeah. There's also now emerging taxonomy that is coming out for basically supporting and understanding what are these new vulnerabilities that we're facing, right? So this is also something that requires us practitioners to be able to identify and iterate on. And the last myth, right? So from prototype to production in only 2 days, right? This is what you think about. You start with Claude Code or you start with something like that, lovable, right? And then suddenly you're so productive. You build something, right? But then after a couple of iterations, you realize you don't know what's going on. It built it on some Next.js, React.js thing. Maybe you're a Python developer. You don't know what's going on, right? So in that case, the 80% may look simple, but the 20% often is absolutely required, right? And we've seen this, Twitter, right? X, whatever you call it, is one of the main areas where you actually find out, for some of those things. So yes, with those myths, right, it gives you a bit of motivation of why it's important for us to understand, what the ecosystem looks like. And with that, we're just going to start diving into some of the nuances of agents. Yeah.
Thanks. Great. Some of this will also be a little bit repetitive in some areas, but this is good. In 2025, probably everyone talks about agents. When I think about agents, right, I come up like tooling, but also protocols. Like in terms of tooling, you've seen probably Devon AI. Anyone heard of Devon AI?
Yep.
Yeah, some of them. So DevNI is kind of like the first autonomous AI software engineer, and it claims to solve a lot of complex problems. But if you look closer, right, it's not correct. But it's a good hype. There are Jules, there's Manos. You probably heard of a Codex, Cloud Code, right? But also Cursor in a way. And there's a lot of protocols coming up, like MCP, agent to agent. And, basically, every week there's some new nuances and protocols that come up with that. Before actually going deeper into some of the topics, first of all, I want to lay up some definition of agents, right? And obviously, we're not going to go too deep in the way because there's also so much nuances like agentic workflows, agents, right? But truly, what are actually agents? In terms of a formal definition, an agent is an AI model, or leverage an AI model to interact with its environment. It's very similar to reinforcement learning, right? To achieve a user-defined objective, it combines reasoning, planning, and execution of actions. Usually, these actions are MCP, right, or functional calling. So if we boil it down, basically you have an AI model, so a large language model. You have a user-defined goals. So for example, find the cheapest flight or optimize basically my supply chain, and the execution of action, like function calling or MCP. This is a dummy example. So you want to have a cup of coffee for your breakfast. Then you ask your agent, please make me a copy for my breakfast. Well, you ask the agent. What does it do? The agents usually, like truly agentic, right, would come up with reasoning and planning, right? So it would come up with a query plan to say, okay, I go to the kitchen, I go to the coffee machine, I check if the beans and water are filled, I brew the coffee, and I bring coffee to the table. I think, from a software engineering perspective, this is very easy, right? These are rules. These are requirements that we built in the past. Now we basically have this fancy, LLMs telling us what are actually the steps that you need to do in between. Once this is done, basically we also give the agent some tools. Basically in this case, brew the coffee. Once it's done, you get a feedback back. Well, this is basically the whole flow of the agent, right? It is very similar if you heard of reinforcement learning or if you've dealt with reinforcement learning before. It is basically the same thing, but in a different terms. Obviously, that was a very, like dummy example. In reality, it's more complicated, right? Basically, you have a user who does a query. You have a lot of tools in between. You use different LLMs, right? You have basically a memory database, which has like short-term, long-term. You have a vector database, and you have a lot of different tools, right? That you connect to. When you think about AI agents, sometimes, right? People always ask me, okay, what's actually the difference between an AI agent versus GenAI as well? So an AI agent usually acts autonomously in an environment, make decisions to achieve some certain goals. And GenAI is different because GenAI usually, you get an input and you create a new content, you generate, right? So these are the two things that you need to remember when you think about AI agents versus generative AI. When you think about AI or agents, right, and also like all the protocols that is coming up, like MCP and agent to agents and all this stuff, right? I want to go back a little bit, like the evolution of the internet. Which is interesting because in 1989, basically the internet was invented, right? And over time, basically different protocols arise, right? So for example, in 1996, HTTP became 1.0. Then in the 2000 years, we had APIs basically first, like with SOAP and then XML. Who of you use XML? Okay, only a few, right? But still, basically XML was the de facto data type structure before, and then JSON replaced basically all XML, right? But if you're a developer, probably you all have JSON-based structure, right? And then over time, basically, you had more fancy stuff like event-driven, Kafka, and so on. And then basically 2024, 2025, we have like MCP and agent to agents. As you can see, we are basically at the very early beginning of a protocol, right? So there's a lot of things, if you use agent these days, you are at the early beginning. There's so many things that is still not there, right? If you look at the whole timeline. Yeah, as I said, so what are the challenges, the limitations overall? Was for me using agents, right? As I said, we are very early, it's very mature. When you use execution, right, it's also not stable all the time. So for example, sometimes you tell the agent to do something and then it doesn't execute, right? Because obviously there's some stochastic component in there, right? So this is not so easy. There's a lack of reliability. I will go deeper more what this means because it is, for simple stuff it's fine, but even for multi-agent or multi-step reasoning, it is not working stable. And obviously standardization, right? So when API came out, you had a lot of definitions that are not stable, and it's changing over time. So if you're creating something today, you don't know whether tomorrow it will hold. And then the aspect that already Alejandro came up is, there's no S in NSAP, right? So there's no security. So they have a OAuth 2.0 draft, but basically for myself, when I had to create my own MCP server that I wanted to expose publicly, right, for a project, I actually had to build my own OAuth layer, right? So this is not like trivial at the moment. Yeah, so this is a very simple example why agents are still complicated, right? And actually, this is basically statistic 101. If you go back to high school, you will know that, if you, for example, have, multi-step reasoning, the probability to the power of n is different when you think about the average, right? So in this case, for example, if you ask the LM what is 70 plus 8, you have maybe a 90% accuracy that is 25. Obviously, you can do validation in there, but statistically, you have a 90% accuracy. But then when you think about multi-step reasoning, right? So you go to the website, select the date and the select origin, and so on. The average is not 90% out of this, right? The average of the probability for the final execution is to the power of n. So if you have n steps in between, the accuracy goes down to 35%. If you have n steps to 20, basically the accuracy goes to 12%, right? And if you think about software engineering in general, in software engineering, you want to fulfill a workflow and you need to have it correctly as much as possible. This is not good enough. All right, then let's go also to one of my favorite topic this year, and probably everyone does it as well. Who actually vibe codes? Wow, not so many actually. So you should actually go home and install Lovable or you work with Lovable or Cursor because obviously this is the new cool thing in this world. All right, so when I was in I don't know in a year, but I was young, right? I was working for Pivotal, a US software company, and basically we got a contract, a very big contract from Volkswagen at the time. It was shit tons of money that we got from Volkswagen to actually teach them software, right? That was me basically in Berlin at the time, coming from Silicon Valley, right, back to Berlin, and then on the ground teaching Volkswagen to do software. It sounds a little bit arrogant, right? But we try to teach them, the Silicon Valley way, kind of, right? So we taught them concepts, culture things like balanced teams, product discovery, lean startups, right? So probably you heard of Eric Ries. So this was one of my colleagues. We taught them design sprints, and in engineering, right? We taught them like culture, right? or basically programming practices like extreme programming, pair programming, test-driven 12-factor apps, being cloud first, right? So these kind of things that modern software engineering is today, right? That was basically 15 years ago, kind of. We had this concept of basically, balanced teams. So we had different stages. So we do like a ideation lab, right, where we create ideas, we come up and we have a discovery framework. And then we had this concept of balanced team where you have 2 software engineers, 1 designer, 1 product managers, and the ideal duration for an MVP to create software was 8 to 12 weeks, right? So that was basically 15 years ago. Then over the time, we also switched from balanced teams 1.0 to balanced teams 2.0. What is balanced teams 2.0? Again, we basically added also data, right? Because data became a very inherent component of a good application. Fast forward 2023, basically, we had the ChatGPT moments, agents, and obviously vibe coding. And as you can see from the Google search, vibe coding is basically a big trend these days. What is actually vibe coding? This is funny. So this is a definition from Andrew Karpathy, who's one of the very respected AI researcher in this world. He tweeted on February 2025 this tweet. It's actually funny because before he did that tweet, I already vibe coded 1 year ago before, right? So he basically laid out a term what I actually was doing as well. So vibe coding basically, is like kind of a new coding paradigm where you fully give the vibes. You just talk to the AI, right? And you don't really touch the keyboard anymore, right? You can ask any stupid things by that, and then basically copy and paste, accept, right? And then it runs, stuff, copy stuff, and execute, right? This is vibe coding. How does it differ from traditional software engineering, right? In the past, basically, I'm a software engineer by experience, and also I have worked in software engineering for so much time. Basically, what I got was, we got product requirements, right? We had a business, they had ideas, right? They wrote it down. Sometimes they were stupid, right? But usually we try to implement them in a way. And then we coded, right? We wrote tests, we did pair programming, we did test-driven development, right? And then we executed. Now with vibe coding, basically the requirements becomes different because now you use English, right? You can use English as a natural language to create code. And then the AI generates codes, and then you get a product, right? So it's two different ways how you can actually generate code. There's many dimensions of vibe coding tools these days, right? So you have like prototyping levels. So for example, Lovable or Replit, right? This is like more for the business people because they also don't know how to code, but it makes them basically easier access to great applications. You have on the feature level, right? You have VS Code with client and all of these tools, what you get. You have Cursor, you have Windsurf, and then you have on the system level, like for example, Cloud Code or Codex and so on. And obviously you have the infrastructure level that you need, right? So you need an LM, and then you need agents how to execute basically vibe coding. So what is my experience with vibe coding in general, right? So I mean, this is also a funny thing because we in the evening or during afternoon we had a talk by the founder of C++, and he actually didn't like AI at all, right? So he was like completely against it. But for me, as a software engineer, I have a feeling that basically with vibe coding, right, I become like much faster doing things that I don't like, right? But there are still some rules that I need to set when I do vibe coding. So when you vibe code, it's not really you use it, you come up with an idea and then you just execute. But you really need a clear understanding of what you want to do, right? So you basically become more like an architect, right? So you need to know what is a tech stack. So should you use for front end Next.js, Nux, or whatever, right? And then one thing that I also can recommend is don't ask the AI to create the full application end to end, but do it step by step, right? So do it in small iterations. Always git commit, right? And then basically work on that. So that's why I also say don't let agent mode go wild because usually this will end up in a lot of security issues as well for that. And then one interesting comment: if you this is also my perspective, right? If you are a good engineer, right? But this debate of what is a good engineer, you become 10 times faster. But usually, if you give it this tool to a software engineer who doesn't understand some concepts of architecture and writing good code, you basically create 10 times more tech debt, right? And this is a huge problem because then you, as a follow developer, and you come up with the code, you basically don't understand the code at all, right? Because it's AI generated, and no one understands basically at the end of the day what this is all about. And then also last tip that I can give. If you work with AI or vibe coding, try to take the popular frameworks, right? Because usually it will not work with some very exotic frameworks. Okay, obviously in the beginning we said there's a job paradoxum, right? Because many people are losing jobs these days, and it is kind of what it is, and it is unfortunate. But basically, from my perspective, vibe coding is going to change software engineering entirely, the way how we are, right? And you need to be prepared for it, right? Because it's not like 2, 3, 4 years ago where you as a software engineer, can earn shit tons of money, right? Because you are so demanded, right? No, AI will actually change you and also the job profession as well. We will get more roles, right? We have like things like vibe coder, front-end developer. Although I'm not a big fan of that, but I believe that engineers become more product engineers, right? So software development is not just basically writing code, writing good product specs anymore, right? But really, also doing stuff in design, doing end-to-end. You can do also DevOps as well, right? So you will become more like a full-stack engineer. I also believe that an engineer, right, is becoming an architect, right? So I don't believe that you just focusing on just writing code, but also designing the entire system. Alejandro also said it, right? So security is very important, right? When you do vibe coding, so you will also become more security aware, right? And not just basically let the security team focuses on that, but really as an engineer as well. And this is also true, right? Vibe coding will become vibe debugging. And if you already vibe code before, then you probably know the meme, right? Basically reviewing the skill, right, to debug is actually a very important skill that a senior shows, right? So most of the time, juniors don't know how to debug code, right? And this is becoming more and more important, right? If you want to be on a track of becoming a good software developer. Yes, and there will be a new wave of entrepreneurs, right? You will have solo entrepreneurs who do everything, create code, right? Create the product and then ship it. You have basically smaller teams, right? So as I said, we're in the beginning, we had this big team of balanced teams. I don't think that you need it anymore, right? You will have smaller teams going forward who are more productive, but still there will be engineers, right? You will not lose your jobs, but your job profession will change. As I said, so the technology is still experimental. It produces still a lot of errors, but you need to be prepared for it, right? So, and for me, what I believe in, a company who use AI is competitive in the future, right? And this is truly, I don't know where it will hold true, but in the next 5 years we will see it.
Great. Yeah, and for me, it just really makes me laugh, right? To see like a job posting that says vibe coding, engineer. It's like back in the day, just putting a job post that says Stack Overflow copy paste engineer, right? So, at the end, it's like, is that the real skill that you're looking to hire for, right? And similarly, I think right now we looked at some of the parts on, let's say, the throughput of work, right? Like, or not specifically just throughput of outputs in terms of code itself, right? So now let's actually think about the question of how does that work go through the entire life cycle, right? Because we've actually seen a lot of surveys recently, right? Some surveys say that AI is making developers more productive. Some surveys say that AI is making developers highly unproductive. Which one is it, right? And I can tell you from personal experience, right, especially from a larger organization where we are really pushing to encourage kind of AI usage. So at the end, if we ask, have we seen metrics that show increase in throughput in PR merge or in number of applications in production or those type of questions? The answer is no, right? Let's now dive into perhaps forming an intuition around that. So obviously, when it comes to tooling, when it started, right, it was like more or less simple, right? I remember the days, when you only had a couple of logos. Fast forward to today, right? We find ourselves in a sea of tools, right? Even in your organization, you probably are fighting with API keys, right? You're fighting with different LLM providers. So how do we think about this? And especially when it comes to the developer sort of life cycle, how do we reason about this? And one way that I really like, I actually showed this on a previous deep dive, is that the developer funnel, if we simplify it, right, the SDLC, the software development lifecycle, we can think of it in a simplified form as writing code, testing QA, architecting and operating, and monitoring and debugging, right? Currently, most of the investment is happening on this side of the funnel, right? And this is the part that actually developers enjoy, right? Like, we enjoy writing code. We like making problem, right, for other people. um, and then on the other side, right, is where the humans are a little bit more unhappy. And when we think about the AI tooling that is available and the AI tooling that is emerging, we see that there is a disparity across, right? So starting from the writing code, right, there's a broad range of different tools. So that already covered quite a few. But there's a lot of things that are allowing us to create more throughput, right? Doesn't have to be good throughput, but it's throughput, right? As we go higher into the funnel, there are starting to be a couple of different tools, right? Things like CodeRabbit or Quoto. So these are things for like code review automation, or also for testing. And recently, actually, we're discussing internally that, the nuances of how do we actually roll this out, right? How do we leverage this in an enterprise context? Do we just let those AI code reviewers merge PRs? What is the impact of that? What happens if something blows up, right? Sitting together with the weekly operational reporting meeting and basically saying, how did this happen? And just say like, well, GitHub merged it, right? Copilot merged it, right? It's not my fault, right? But there's actually even less maturity of those tools. Let's go one step further, right? We start looking at some of the tools on the architecting and operating. So we're starting to see, tools like, Kubernetes GPT, right? Basically plug in, an LLM into your kubectl, right? Who's going to do that, right? I mean, maybe with read access, right? But I don't know if you're going to just give it like, full cluster edit access. And a lot of the tools here are just to create configuration, right? Create YAML, create CloudFormation scripts, right? But at the end, there's not much kind of like insights that are coming out of that. And at the end, actually, I was joking the other day that I probably have been also working in the, let's say, cloud native space. So building like machine learning infrastructure with, Golang for Kubernetes, so Kubernetes operators. So been in, kind of like working on that. I like to call myself jokingly a YAML engineer, right? Because that's probably like more what I do. Nowadays, I think I'm going to start calling myself a markdown engineer, right? Because we're starting to debug Markdown, right? Which is a little bit sad. But this is kind of like as we go through the funnel. Right now we're seeing less and less maturity on the tools, less and less scope, and just chatbots that are giving us more YAML, right? Is that really helping? I don't know. And then at the bottom of the funnel, the monitoring and debugging, there are some interesting tools that are appearing, right? Obviously, Sentry's outside. I'm going to speak nicely, right? Great tools, right? But then again, right, as we go through the funnel, we're still kind of like having more questions. How do we actually enable things that may have more direct impact into production, right? There are some interesting approaches, but I think as that mentioned, we are still in what we would consider kind of like the early days of the internet, right? And I actually really like that reference. Particularly because also working in other large organizations, right, that have been, working since the 70s, let's say, we actually find that in some cases they have their own custom, protocols in there, right? So that already shows you how right now we're in an element where we're still kind of like discovering those areas. Now, when it comes to these tools, what we need to now think about is how do we actually go beyond just creating more output and then enabling those parts lower into the development funnel to actually create more outcome, right? And obviously here, right, really pushing to make us humans a little bit happier, right? Perhaps us being able to, have fun, be creative, I think as that mentioned, be architects, but not end up just being kind of like debugging machines that, forever are just like, going through crappy code that an AI wrote, right? I mean, that really doesn't sound like an exciting future. I mean, if that is, it is what it is. But, that's something that like we can really focus towards. When it comes to tooling, right now the interesting thing is that this developer funnel can actually fit one-to-one to other funnels, right? This would be to also the creative funnel, right? When it comes to things on, for example, video generation, right? I don't know if you've managed to see that there had been actually some really interesting approaches even before some of the tools were more mature to create 3D animations or even like animated films with basically just shots of people in their rooms or whatever, and then passing them through some of these models. But at the end, again, this is the question of like, creating more of that output, and then making sure that we can enable through investment on the lower parts of the funnel, right? The review, the etc., right? Because at the end, that still has to happen, right? So similarly, there's some interesting tools, I guess, on the music ones. I don't know if anyone here has actually tried some of those, like Udio or Suno. Maybe raise your hands. I mean, they're pretty impressive, right? They make me feel like I actually have some musical talent, right? Even if I don't. But it is actually interesting to see. Again, this is tools that are coming at the top of the funnel, right? Now it's thinking about, kind of like how do we invest further and further towards those. Other interesting areas, obviously voice is something that has been for much longer, same as images. But there are also really cool things happening on the 3D space, right? For example, training models to generate 3D assets, right? And then going from there, actually being able to generate not just 3D assets, but even animations. There's also foundation models that are being created to simulate worlds, right? So in this case, it would be basically a model that is trained with, let's say, for example, inputs, right? Moving forward, with then basically the behavior of that. And then you're actually interacting with a model, right? With inputs, right? Even potentially with your keyboard or whatever. And you're actually in you could say, a world that is being generated by these LLMs, right? And that is actually evolving. Another space that I didn't put here, but it's also very interesting, is foundation models that are appearing in areas that are a little bit less, I guess, flashy, right? Things like forecasting. So we're seeing a lot of forecasting foundation models. So obviously this is more for operational process of businesses. Similarly for tabular use cases, right? So we're seeing a lot of foundation models that are emerging from graph neural networks for that space, right? We actually saw one release yesterday. But indeed, so here, the main call out is how do we think about going beyond, lower into the funnel, and also beyond just the chatbots themselves. To summarize some of those challenges that have been emerged, right? Obviously, the one that we discussed is the top of the funnel sort of bottleneck, right? That a lot of the stuff is coming at the very start, right? And we need to invest more towards that. But there's other sort of challenges that we see, right? With so much choice, we have an explosion of vendor and service complexity, right? Obviously, too many API keys. How do we manage them? Organizations are also wrestling with that. So how do we actually even, guard the procurement processes so that we don't end up with 5 of the same tools, right? Similarly, right now, a lot of the tools that are coming up are just basically chatbots with a bit of a wrapper, right? This is something that now it is possible to invest to go beyond that, right? That was saying like there's a lot of use cases that, can really be right for that. And then similarly, that lack of best practices, we're still at the very early stage, right? I think at that level, this is where we need to think about, how do we contribute to those standards, to those, basically to the future direction of where this is going, so that we can make sure that we actually can benefit as a developer community from there. So one of the things that I was also very excited to do in this session is give a bit of an outlook, right? And basically try to predict that we wanted to do is the next 10 years. Which is a little bit crazy, right? I mean, if you had asked me to predict the next 10 years in 2015, right? I mean, I probably would have invested in different, companies.
Bitcoins.
Bitcoin, right? Even before thinking about agents, right? But this is something that I think we want to do. Before that, just want to give a bit of an intuition of what are the current limitations. Where are we today, right? So we ran a survey back last year. We're actually wrapping up the survey for this year. And we saw a couple of insights just in general kind of machine learning concepts. And we're seeing that actually, for example, in machine learning serving, so basically running, let's say, an LLM and actually running basically the inference through that, there's about 60% of the tooling is running on custom tooling, right? So there's no kind of like, standardized framework that allows you to actually run this. And what is even more scary than that is last year, about 50% of production machine learning applications did not have monitoring in production, right? So let that sink in, right? So I mean, I think that number in itself is something that we as a community have to really change. And as we're making these predictions for the next 10 years, right, we have to take into consideration where we are right now, right, which is nowhere near where we should, right? And maybe just the call out, I would really recommend for you to check out the survey. If you have some time, fill it out. What we're now going to do is let's go back into the future and let's dive and see what that actually looks like. So let's say, we start running towards, 2035. Today, we run into 2027. And basically here we assume, some safe predictions, right? I don't want to go like, too crazy. Most organizations will have hired AI engineers. Everyone has at least their own personal agents. Today we already kind of have that for chatbots, but not yet for agents themselves. Obviously, those are the green ones, but now actually going into the more amber ones, unified standard for machine learning monitoring arrives, but actually I would even say a new standard for context arrives, right? So this is something that we're actually currently seeing, that the heterogeneity is, exploding right now. I can tell you that it hasn't peaked, right? One of the, again, kind of like bets is that it will only peak until 2027, right? Just imagine that. That's going to take, already well. We know that today, as of today, the actual time to get to production from an AI application, right, takes about 3 to 6 months. So hoping that by 2027, it will be less than 1 month. We'll see. Not very clear on that one, but hopefully. We've seen some standards, right, in software engineering, right, like OpenTelemetry, that have managed to do this for monitoring, right? But here is something that we're actually seeing some of the companies like Anthropic, etc., OpenAI, that are trying to race against those different protocols. 2030, right? We arrive. The bet here is MLOps unifies, right? We actually start seeing a standard that brings together this machine learning operations and the LLM operations. So this is actually going to enable basically these communities to really come together and drive some of those areas. Most organizations have a central agentic platform, right? So whether build or buy. And some of those, and there's something to remember, some of those inference subsidies that, you think to yourself, oh, the tokens are very cheap, right? Like, right now I can run so much. My bet is that 2030 is when they stop, right? What does that mean? I mean, maybe actually efficiency peaks and everything just becomes super cheap, or it becomes so critical that, we have to pay for those things. And by then, we actually expect that hopefully the monitoring, evals, etc., are standardized to 90%. Then we go to 2033, right? In 2033, the assumption is that we now start seeing intelligent progressive rollouts, right? So basically, this could be seen as self-healing systems, right? You build a feature, it goes to production. In production, it goes as a canary, right, or a shadow deployment, and then the promotion is done once basically the agent decides that it's ready. Root cause analysis and system optimization, also done by agents. So this is basically betting that we will have not just the ability to roll out safely, but also being able to actually do root cause analysis. I think this one, 2033, that's a long time. Hopefully we manage that. And then we actually start seeing a new emerging trend going from LLMOps, which we hear a lot today, to autonomous ops or agent ops, I don't know how to call it, right? This is basically not just managing LLMs, but actually orchestrating autonomous systems, right? That basically manage the stack themselves. And obviously, as part of that, we will see a lot of kind of like heterogeneity emerging. So as part of that, basically the self-healing systems, standardize coming to 2035. As part of that, autonomous rollouts reach a mass adoption, right? We start seeing kind of the systems allowing for not just feature development, but actually lower down the funnel. We actually see that the agentic approaches are starting to derive value. GPU inference costs finally optimized, so those subsidies catch up, and finally we can pay for it. And hopefully, medium time to production decreases. We move towards a world where we are in software engineering, where in software, we often see that you actually have multiple deployments per day, right? However, in ML, hopefully that is the case. So that is the predictions. Hold me accountable. Let's see 2035 in the next code talks. But with that, I think this is a good place to stop. And I want to thank you all. Remember that is the code for the link for the presentation slides if you want to access them. So thank you all. I appreciate it.